Her ex mistook her as the maid at their family home because she was black, African. He didn't know she was his ex, who was now his aunt. Inside the $10 million Korean Mafia estate, Min-ho corners Jane. He sees her in an apron and assumes she's the staff. He doesn't realize she spent the morning mastering his grandmother's recipes and winning her heart. "You're in my family's house," he said, low and tight, "acting like you belong here. You should know your place." He snarls, swinging his hand to slap her. Jane catches his wrist mid-air. No fear, just pure power. "I'm your aunt now. Show some respect." Welcome back, my amazing Afro-Korean lovers family. To my former subscribers and the new Afro-Korean squad, it's good to have you here for this wonderful revenge and instant regret story. Kindly subscribe to join the K-Mafia family. Jane had been in the estate since 10 in the morning, 4 hours early, because that was simply who she was. She didn't perform warmth. She built it. Braised short ribs, seafood John, japchae tossed with sesame oil. The grandmother had nodded once from the doorway, and that nod meant everything. Ji-hoon, the Korean mafia boss, and her husband had texted, "Running 15 minutes late, I love you." And she'd smiled and gone back to stirring. She didn't hear the front door. Min-ho walked into the estate the way he always walked into rooms, like the space had been waiting for him, like his arrival reorganized the air. They had dated for 8 months 2 years ago. She had ended it. He had not entirely accepted this. He came through the hallway toward the dining room, nodding at the uncles, kissing his grandmother's cheek, and then he turned the corner and saw the kitchen, saw the woman in the apron, her back to him, moving with quiet efficiency between the stove and the counter. He didn't recognize her from behind, or perhaps he did and filed it away incorrectly, the mind protecting itself through assumption. Here, in his uncle's house, on a day when the family had gathered, a woman in an apron standing at someone else's stove read his staff. His brain made that calculation in under a second and moved on. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who doesn't think they need to be polite. "Is there water out? Nobody's put water on the table." Jane turned around. The moment lasted less than a second, but contained a great deal. She saw him. She absorbed him fully, the familiar set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved over her face without softening, without any of the shame she might have once hoped to see there. She watched the exact moment he recognized her, and she watched him decide, in real time, that this changed nothing. That whatever recalibration a decent person might perform, he was not going to perform it. What she felt was not fear. She had been afraid of him once, afraid of his moods and his silences and the way he could make her feel small without raising his voice. She had spent 8 months learning the particular architecture of his contempt. She knew every room in that building. It held no power over her anymore. "Min-ho," she said simply. "What are you—" He stopped, looked around the kitchen, at the spread she'd prepared, at the apron she was wearing. Something shifted in his expression, not into warmth, but into a sharper kind of disdain. "You work here now?" "No." "Then what are you doing in the kitchen?" "Cooking," she said, "for the family dinner." He let out a short sound, not quite a laugh. "Okay, sure. Well, the table still needs water." She held his gaze. She did not move toward the water. This was the thing about Min-ho. He had always mistaken stillness for submission. He had always believed that if he waited long enough, pushed just firmly enough, she would fold. It was a belief she had spent the last 2 years dismantling inside herself, and she felt its absence now like a clean, healed scar. "Jane." His voice dropped, took on an edge she recognized. "I'm not going to ask twice." "You haven't asked once," she said. "You've only told." The kitchen had gone very quiet. One of the aunties, who had been arranging serving spoons near the doorway, had become extremely still. Min-ho took a step toward her. She didn't step back. This seemed to genuinely surprise him. She could see it in the small tightening around his eyes, the way his body recalibrated into something meaner. He had always found her composure infuriating. He had told her so more than once in those last months. "You make yourself impossible to reach," he'd said, as if that were a failing. "You're in my family's house," he said, low and tight, "acting like you belong here. You should know your place." Rage moved into his face at having been talked back to. His hand moved. It was fast, the kind of fast that comes from someone who has done something like it before, or thought about doing it, or lived so long with the belief that they could. His palm swung up and out in a short, sharp arc aimed at her cheek. She caught his wrist. Her grip was firm, not violent. There was no drama in it, no adrenaline shaking her hands. She simply caught him, the way you catch a door before it slams. She held his wrist steady in the air between them, and she looked at him, and she said, "I'm your aunt now. Show some respect." The room stopped. The auntie in the doorway made a small sound. The uncle, who had been reaching for another piece of jaune, did not complete the motion. The grandmother, who had appeared silently at the edge of the kitchen, drawn perhaps by some ancestral instinct for when her house was shifting on its foundations, stood very still with her hands folded in front of her. Min-ho stared at her, his wrist still in her hand, his face moving through several expressions at speed, none of them landing cleanly. His aunt, which means his uncle's wife. "What?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Ji-hoon," she said. "I married Ji-hoon 1 month ago." The front door opened. Ji-hoon came in already apologizing, already loosening his tie, his voice carrying ahead of him through the hallway. I know, I said, 15 minutes. Forgive me." And then he turned into the kitchen and stopped. He took in the room in the way of someone who had been trained, somewhere deep in his formation, to read situations immediately and completely. His grandmother's face, his aunt in the doorway, the stillness of the air, his wife, his nephew's wrist, in his wife's hand. Raised, his face did not do anything dramatic. It went, instead, very quiet. The apology that had been in his voice evaporated. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, with his tie half loosened, and he was absolutely, perfectly still. And somehow that stillness was louder than anything else in the room. "Ji-hoon," Min-ho started. "Don't," his grandmother said. "One word." She didn't raise her voice. Ji-hoon walked to his wife. He placed his hand gently at the small of her back, not pulling her behind him, not positioning himself in front of her, just with her. He looked at his nephew. "You can let go," Jane said quietly. She released Min-ho's wrist. Min-ho lowered his arm. He was doing the math now. She could see it happening, the family connections reordering themselves in his face. His uncle, his uncle's wife, the woman he had stood in front of 2 years ago and decided was nothing. The uncles had appeared in the doorway. The second auntie had come in from the dining room. Everyone was looking at Min-ho. Ji-hoon had not yet said a single word to him. He didn't need to. The quality of his silence said everything that would take another man a great deal of volume to express. "Let's set the table," Ji-hoon said finally, to no one and everyone. His voice was calm and flat and carried no warmth at all. "We'll eat." He pulled out a chair for his grandmother first. Then he held out his hand to Jane, not to rescue her, but to stand beside her, and she took it, and they walked to the table together. Ji-hoon sat at the head of the table. Jane was to his right. Min-ho had been placed, by no one and everyone simultaneously, at the far end, which felt both accidental and just. The grandmother ate. This was the thing about her. She had lived through enough history to know that the world did not pause for discomfort, and that food going cold was its own kind of waste. She lifted her chopsticks and served herself, and the aunties, reading the signal, began to do the same. The uncles poured drinks. Someone complimented the japchae. Someone else asked, too brightly, about the weather expected next week. Min-ho said nothing. He held his chopsticks without using them. Ji-hoon let it sit for exactly as long as politeness required. Then he set down his glass. The small sound of it against the table landed, like a door closing. "Min-ho," he said. Everyone understood this was not the beginning of a conversation. "Kneel," Ji-hoon said, "and apologize to my wife." The table did not gasp. They were too well bred for that. But the silence that followed was the shape of a gasp. An uncle stilled his chopsticks mid-air. The younger auntie looked at her lap. The grandmother continued eating, which was its own form of verdict. Min-ho looked up. His jaw moved before his words did. "You're serious," he said. "I don't say things I'm not serious about." Ji-hoon's voice had not changed in temperature. It was even and quiet and implacable. "Kneel," Apologize. For what? Minho's chin lifted. I didn't know who she was. If I'd known, the apology, Ji-hoon said, is not contingent on whether you knew who she was. Minho pushed back slightly from the table, not rising, not submitting, hovering in that adolescent middle space where pride performs itself as dignity. I'm not going to kneel down in front of an ex-girlfriend in the middle of a family dinner. I don't care who she married. It was the ex-girlfriend that did it, not to Ji-hoon. His expression didn't flicker. But Jane, who had sat through all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her posture composed, felt something move in her chest. Not anger exactly. More like a door she'd kept closed for 2 years, developing a crack in its frame. She had not planned to speak. She had come here to cook and to be welcomed and to begin the careful, good work of becoming part of this family. She had not come to excavate herself at the dinner table. But Minho said ex-girlfriend, the way you might say irrelevant detail, the way you scrub something out of a sentence before it can make meaning. And she had listened to that voice rewrite her for 8 months, and she was finished letting it have the last word. I'd like to say something, Jane said. Ji-hoon looked at her. Whatever he saw in her face made him settle back, just slightly. The floor is yours. She looked at Minho. Not with hatred. She had burned through hatred for him long ago, used it as fuel, and come out the other side into something cooler and more permanent. She looked at him the way you look at something you survived. We were together for 8 months, she began. Her voice was steady. From the outside, it probably looked like a relationship. We went to dinners. He introduced me to people. I thought I was being loved. It took me a long time to understand what was actually happening, that he was not loving me, but organizing me, deciding what I wore, who I could speak to, how much I could eat before he made a comment. He checked my phone. He tracked where I was, and when I was late coming home, he would be waiting with questions that were not really questions. He told me I was lucky that he had chosen me. He said it enough times that I began to believe it. The table was perfectly, completely silent. He was unfaithful. Twice that I know of, and I know of the second one because the woman contacted me herself. When I confronted him, he told me I was imagining things. Then he told me I was too sensitive. Then he told me I had driven him to it. She paused, just briefly. He did not kneel then either. He never apologized for anything. Apology, I came to understand, was not something he believed he owed other people. Minho's face had gone through red and was coming out the other side into something paler. I ended the relationship. He told me I would regret it. He said, she stopped. Something flickered across her composure like a shadow over water, there and gone. He said no one of any real consequence would ever want me after him, that I had been given something I didn't deserve, and I had thrown it away. She folded her hands a little tighter in her lap. I thought about that for a long time, longer than I should have. She looked away from Minho then, as if he no longer required her attention, which was, of all the things she'd done today, perhaps the most devastating. I came here today to make a good impression, she said, to the table, to the family, to the grandmother who had set down her chopsticks and was watching Jane with dark, still eyes. I wanted you to taste my cooking and feel my care for your family, for Ji-hoon. I'm sorry the evening became this. Ji-hoon reached under the table and found her hand. Don't apologize, his grandmother said. It was the first time she had spoken in 20 minutes. Her voice was not loud, and it didn't need to be. She looked at her grandson Minho then, the way a woman looks at something she has allowed too long. There was no cruelty in it, but there was a finality that could not be mistaken for anything else. Apologize, Ji-hoon said again. He hadn't let go of Jane's hand. No. Minho stood up. Pride was all he had left, and he wore it badly, the way you wear something that no longer fits. I'm not going. To perform some punishment because you married someone you barely know, and she's decided to drag up. You raised your hand to her, Ji-hoon said. Silence. In this house, at this table, in front of our grandmother. He let that sit for 1 beat, too. And you will not apologize. It was, Minho started. Then we're finished here. Ji-hoon released Jane's hand, rose from the table, and moved to the sideboard where his phone lay. He made one call. It lasted 45 seconds. His voice was low enough that only the shape of his authority carried back to the table, not the words. When he returned, he sat down, and he served himself more rice, and he said, "The Daejeon accounts, the Southern Retail Division, and the logistics subsidiary that Minho's branch has been managing. Effective Monday, they return to the central office. Interim directors will be appointed by end of week." One of the uncles exhaled. "Ji-hoon," Minho said, "you can't. It's done." He picked up his chopsticks. "You're welcome to stay and eat, or you can go. That choice is yours." Minho looked at his grandmother. It was the look of a child who has misbehaved so many times that he no longer quite believes in consequences, looking now at the face that is supposed to soften. She looked back at him. She picked up her chopsticks. Minho left. He didn't slam the door. That at least he knew better then. The dinner continued for another hour. It was quieter than it should have been, warmer than it had any right to be. The grandmother asked Jane about her mother's recipe for the braised ribs, and Jane answered in careful, grateful detail. An uncle told a story that made everyone laugh despite themselves. The Jean was finished completely. Every piece, which Jane had learned, was the highest possible compliment. When the family began to gather their things and say their goodbyes, the grandmother took Jane's hands in both of hers at the door. Her palms were dry and small and very strong. She held them for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, in Korean, something that Ji-hoon translated quietly into Jane's ear on the ride home. She said, "You have a good spine." She said that's rarer than people think. The apartment was quiet when they got home. Ji-hoon drew her a bath without asking, the way he had learned in 1 month of marriage to recognize when she needed warmth applied from the outside because generating it internally had temporarily depleted her. He set a glass of water beside the tub. He didn't hover. When she came out, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in his dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, turning his watch over in his hands. She sat beside him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Strip his accounts." "I know. It'll cause problems." "Probably." She looked at the side of his face. "You're not sorry." "No," he said simply. "I'm not." She rested her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her and pulled her in. Not dramatically, not performing comfort, just adjusting her into the place she fit. She felt him breathe. She felt her own breathing begin, slowly, to match his. "I didn't want to tell it all," she said after a while, "in front of everyone." "I know. I'm not sure I feel better." "You don't have to feel better tonight." He pressed his mouth briefly to her hair. "Tonight you just have to sleep." She had not cried yet, and she suspected she wasn't going to, that whatever needed to move through her would find its own timeline, and she had learned to leave it alone. She closed her eyes instead. She let the weight of the day arrange itself into something she could carry. She was nearly asleep when she heard him settle fully beside her, his arms still around her, his warmth steady and unhurried. She was fully asleep when his phone rang. He looked at the screen without moving, without disturbing her, without changing the quality of his stillness, just shifted, his eyes down to read the name. Minho's father. He looked at it through 3 rings. 4. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something large and dangerous in very small, controlled movements. A slight tension at the jaw, a breath held a half-second longer than usual. He looked at his wife sleeping, the way she had stood in that kitchen, the way she had spoken at that table, not for sympathy, not for effect, but with the simple, exhausted dignity of someone putting down something they'd carried alone for too long. He silenced the phone. He set it face down on the nightstand. There would be time for that conversation tomorrow. It would not be a comfortable one, and he was not going to have it tonight, here in the dark with her breathing slowly beside him. He lay back down. He put his arm around her again. His phone glowed once, silent, against the nightstand, a missed call, a certainty of more to come, and then went dark. Outside, the city continued its indifferent business. Inside, Ji-hoon stayed awake a long time, thinking about the kind of man his uncle had raised and what precisely he was going to do about it. Ji-hoon's office occupied the top floor of a building that had been in the family for 30 years. He was reviewing contracts when his assistant knocked and told him his uncle and cousin had arrived. He looked up. "Send them in." He did not stand. Minho's father, Sung-min, was 61 years old and had spent most of those years leveraging his proximity to the family's main branch into a personal mythology of importance. He was charming in the way of men who have discovered early that charm is more efficient than sincerity. He wore it like a good coat, always on, never quite his own. He came in ahead of Minho, hand already extended, smile already arranged. "Ji-hoon," he said warmly, as if they were meeting for golf. "Thank you for seeing us." Ji-hoon shook his hand once, briefly. He did not correct the informal address. He simply looked at his uncle and waited. Sung-min settled into the chair across the desk without being invited to sit. Minho took the chair beside him. He had the decency, at least, to look at the carpet. "I'll be honest with you," Sung-min began, and Ji-hoon noted, as he always did, that people who announce their honesty rarely intend to practice it. "Yesterday got out of hand. Families, you know how it is. Emotions, new relationships, old histories bumping into each other at dinner." He laughed, a comfortable, dismissive sound. "Minho's young. He's stupid sometimes. I've told him that myself. But to strip the accounts over what would you call it, a domestic misunderstanding? Ji-hoon, you're a serious man. This isn't a serious matter." Ji-hoon said nothing. Sung-min waited a moment, recalibrated, continued. "Your wife, and I mean no disrespect, she and Minho have a complicated history. I understand that's uncomfortable, but she came into a family gathering carrying that history, and things got heated, and he raised his hand to her," Ji-hoon said. The room adjusted to his voice. He hadn't raised it. "He raised his hand," Ji-hoon repeated, "in our grandmother's house, at a family dinner, to my wife." He let a pause sit there cleanly. "Tell me how to hear that as a misunderstanding." Sung-min's smile didn't disappear. It just stopped reaching anything. No one is excusing. He also declined to apologize. "The boy has pride. You were young once." "I'm asking you," Ji-hoon said, "to tell me a version of what happened that justifies reversing my decision. I've been sitting here since 7 this morning. I've been thorough. I want to be fair." He folded his hands on the desk. "Take your time." Sung-min talked for another 12 minutes. Ji-hoon had a talent, one he had developed deliberately over years, for listening to a person completely while revealing nothing. He let his uncle arrange and rearrange the events of the previous evening. He watched the man try several different frames. Boys will be boys. New wives are sensitive. Old relationships create confusion. Surely this can be handled quietly. Surely a man of Ji-hoon's standing doesn't let a dinner party reshape a business arrangement. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "The decision stands." Sung-min's composure finally showed its first crack. Ji-hoon, the Daejeon accounts, the Southern Retail Division, and the logistics subsidiary will be managed centrally, effective Monday as stated. If Minho apologizes to my wife directly and sincerely, we can discuss a path forward for his position in the company. Not those positions, others. He picked up his pen. That offer has a limited window. "You're doing this over a woman." "I'm doing this," Ji-hoon said, with the absolute unraised precision of someone who does not need volume to be dangerous, "because someone in my family treated my wife as if she were beneath the family. She is not beneath the family. She is the family." He looked at his uncle steadily. "If that framing is difficult for you, that's a problem I cannot help you with today." Minho, who had said nothing for the entire meeting, looked up for the first time. Something moved across his face that was not quite remorse, closer to the dawning comprehension of a person who has mistaken a lake for shallow water and is only now feeling the depth. Ji-hoon had already looked back down at his contracts. "Thank you for coming in," he said. He told Jane that evening while she stood in the kitchen making tea, and she listened with her back half turned to him, her hands moving through the familiar ritual of warming the cups. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He called her a woman," Ji-hoon said, "like it was a category of problem, something I was being irrational about." His voice was composed, and his jaw was not. "What infuriates me, what I can't," he stopped, restarted. "They cannot see you as someone who deserves dignity. They see you as something that happened to me, an inconvenience I've become emotional about." Jane set the cup down and turned around. Ji-hoon. It's insulting. It's Ji-hoon. She crossed to him and placed both hands on either side of his face, the way you reorient someone, and made him look at her. They will learn, or they won't, and it won't matter because you and I know exactly who I am. She studied him. You held a whole meeting for me this morning. You held the line. I felt it from across the city. She tilted her head, something small and warm in her expression. Let it breathe. He put his hands over hers. He breathed. Go meet Mia, he said after a moment. 5 days before, Jane had arranged to meet Mai, her best friend, up at a cafe for weekly catch-ups. I'm going. She kissed him once, brief and sure, then picked up her bag from the counter. Don't be furious while I'm gone. It raises your blood pressure. He almost smiled. The cafe Mia had chosen was small and loud in the good way. Jane arrived first, as she always did, and had already ordered when Mia swept in. Large sunglasses, larger energy, both arms out. Tell me everything, Mia said before she had fully sat down. I heard the summary and I need the texture. They talked for an hour. Mia was one of those people who listened with her whole body, leaning in, making sounds at the right moments, her face cycling through outrage and satisfaction and warm, fierce protectiveness, as Jane told her about the kitchen, the wrist, the table, what she'd said, what Ji-hoon had done. By the end, Mia's coffee was cold, and her expression was the specific radiant fury of a loyal friend who has been told something that happened to her by proxy. I need you to know, Mia said, that I would have bitten him. I know. I'm not even slightly joking. I know that too. The door to the cafe opened. Jane knew before she turned around, the way you sometimes know things in your body before your mind has processed the information, a prickling at the back of the neck, a slight drop in the temperature of the moment. Minho came in with 2 friends she didn't recognize, easy and loud, stopping just inside the door when he saw her. A beat of surprise, then something worse than surprise, amusement. He said something to the friends. They glanced at her. One of them smirked. Remarkable, Minho said, crossing toward their table without being invited into the conversation. You're everywhere. He looked at Mia briefly, dismissed her, looked back at Jane. How's the new title treating you, Mrs. Chairman? He said it the way you say a joke, the way you take something real and hollow it out. Does it feel different, walking around with a borrowed last name, thinking it makes you somebody? Jane looked at him. Because from where I stand, he continued, and his voice had the particular quality of someone performing for an audience, you're still exactly what you were before. Marrying up doesn't change the original material. He smiled. And just so we're clear, there is no apology coming. Not today, not ever. You can tell your husband I said so. Minho, Jane started. No, actually, Mia said. Her voice was pleasant. Her hand was already on her phone. Mia, Jane said. I just want him to repeat that, Mia said, still pleasantly, and Ji-hoon was already on the line. Jane could see it in the way Mia held the phone angled up, the call already connected, the specific satisfied angle of Mia's chin. Go ahead, Minho. The part about borrowed names and original material, that was a good one. The color left Minho's face in a way that would have been satisfying if Jane were that kind of person. She wasn't, but she didn't stop Mia either. Mia, hang up. Minho stepped forward. He's approaching me, Mia said into the phone, conversationally. Is that relevant? She listened for a moment, then held the phone toward Jane. He wants to say something to you. Jane took the phone. Go home, Ji-hoon said. His voice was quiet and extremely calm and made the back of her neck prickle for an entirely different reason. I'll handle this. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said. He didn't. I know. Go home. Tell Mia thank you. Ji-hoon, don't. Jane, he said, not commanding, something gentler than that, a man asking his wife to trust him. Go home. She handed the phone back to Mia, who concluded the call with a brief, "You're welcome," that was directed at no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. They left Minho standing in the middle of the cafe, 2 friends who were no longer smirking, and the quiet aftermath of his own words being used against him. He didn't know which company until his father called. Ji-hoon had moved faster than anyone anticipated, faster, probably, than Minho had believed possible, because he had made the mistake of thinking yesterday's response was the maximum. The Ji-hoon had played his largest card and could now be waited out. The Northern Distribution Network, which Min-ho's father's branch had held for 11 years, was gone. Not reduced, not reviewed. Gone, folded into the central office by close of business, a single email sent to the relevant directors with Ji-hoon's signature at the bottom and a politeness in the language that somehow made it worse. Sung-min called at 9:40 in the evening. Jane heard Ji-hoon answer from the other room. She heard through the door the quality of the call, the man's voice carrying even at a distance, the shape of it high and scrambling. She heard Ji-hoon respond twice, briefly, and then there was nothing. He came back into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked tired in the way he sometimes allowed himself to look when it was just the two of them. "Well," he said. "Is he upset?" Jane asked. Ji-hoon considered the word. "He's speechless," he said, which from what I understand is rare. Jane looked at her husband. "You moved quickly." "He told you," Ji-hoon said simply, "that you would never be a somebody, in a cafe, in public." He looked at her. What exactly did he expect? She didn't have an answer. Or rather, she had the answer. Min-ho had expected nothing, because he had never in his life dealt with a consequence that arrived this fast, this quietly, and with this much more to come. Ji-hoon reached over and turned off the lamp on his side of the bed. "His father will call again tomorrow," he said, into the dark. "What will you tell him?" A pause. Outside, the city moved. "That Min-ho knows what to do," Ji-hoon said, "and that the window is closing." The CEO dinner was held at the Park Hyatt. The family came in their good clothes and their good manners and arranged themselves around the room with the practiced ease of people who had been attending evenings like this since childhood. Jane wore midnight blue. Ji-hoon had said nothing when he saw her except to offer his arm, which said everything. They arrived together and stayed close in the early part of the evening, greeting, being greeted, the careful choreography of a family assembling its public face. The grandmother was already there when they arrived, seated at a corner table with two older women Jane didn't recognize, holding a glass of water and watching the room with the attentiveness of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by people but remains interested in them. She caught Jane's eye across the room and nodded once. Jane nodded back. Sung-min found his son near the bar at 8:15. Jane didn't see the conversation. She was across the room, talking to one of the aunties about nothing consequential, the kind of pleasant surface talk that formal dinners require, but Ji-hoon saw it. He told her about it later in the car. How his uncle had positioned himself beside Min-ho with a drink in hand and a smile on his face, and spoken through that smile without moving it, the way men of that generation delivered ultimatums, as if they were observations, as if the choice had already been made and the conversation was merely a courtesy. Tonight, before dessert, go and apologize to the woman and mean it, and then we call Ji-hoon over and it ends here. The companies come back, we move forward, this whole thing disappears. Min-ho had stared into his glass. "It is not a request," his father had said, still smiling. Then he had walked away to talk to someone more pleasant. Jane felt him approach before she saw him. A particular quality in the air, a slight redirection of her own attention that she recognized from years of learning to track him. She excused herself from the auntie, "I'll be right back," and turned, and there was Min-ho at the edge of the room, inclining his head toward the corridor. Outside, the universal signal for "can we talk privately," which Jane had once been conditioned to obey, and now simply evaluated. She went. Not because she was obligated, but because she wanted to hear it. She wanted to stand in front of whatever this was and take its full measure. The corridor was quiet, carpeted, lit by the same flattering warmth as the main room. Min-ho had his hands in his pockets. He looked, she thought, like a man attempting to remember the lines of a play he hadn't rehearsed. "I wanted to talk to you," he said. "I know." A pause. He shifted his weight. His eyes moved to a point somewhere near her collarbone rather than her face, which she recognized. It was how he'd always delivered things he didn't want to be held accountable for, addressing the space around her rather than her directly, as if the conversation were happening slightly to her left. "What happened at the dinner?" he said. "And the cafe? I was out of line." Jane said nothing. The silence appeared to unsettle him. He'd always needed her to manage his discomfort, she remembered. To say it's okay or I understand or we can move past this. To do the work of receiving an apology in a way that relieved him of the weight of having given one. "I'm apologizing," he said with a faint edge as if she'd missed the point. "I heard you." "So, Minho." She looked at him steadily. "You practiced that on the way over. You're looking at my shoulder. You smirked twice in the last 30 seconds. She tilted her head. "That's not an apology. That's a transaction." His jaw tightened. "I'm standing here." "You're standing here," she said, gesturing to the empty corridor, to the closed door behind them, to the careful privacy of it. "You pulled me away from the room, away from the family, away from witnesses." She let that sit a moment. "That's not a coincidence, Minho. You don't want to apologize. You want to complete a task, quietly, where no one can see, so you can go back in there and tell your father it's done." He said nothing. Which was, she thought, the first honest thing he'd offered all evening. "If you want to apologize," Jane said, and her voice was calm and clear, and carried no heat at all, "do it the same way you almost humiliated me, in front of everyone." She left him in the corridor. The door opened, and she stepped back into the warmth and noise of the room, back into the light, and crossed to where Ji-hoon stood with two of the uncles. He saw her face, and read it completely in the time it took her to reach him. His expression didn't change in a way the uncles would have noticed, but she saw the slight shift in his eyes, the question asked and answered without a word. She picked up her glass. She stood beside him. The uncles continued their conversation. Later, near the end of the evening, when the room had loosened and the dessert plates were being cleared, Ji-hoon found a moment and told her quietly what he intended. "He wants this to end," Ji-hoon said. "His father wants it to end. They want to give a performance of accountability and have everything restored and move on as if the thing that happened has been adequately addressed." He looked at her. "I don't think it has been adequately addressed." She looked back at him. "What are you thinking?" 500,000, he said. "Damages for what he put you through during the relationship." He said it plainly, the way he said all things, not as a suggestion, not as a question, but as a position he had arrived at after thought and was now stating. "It's not about the money. You know that." She did know that. It was about the weight of it, about making the thing real and countable, giving it a number so it could not be waved away as sensitivity, as history, as two people with a complicated past. It was about Minho reaching into his pocket and feeling it every time. "He won't," she said. "I know." "You know, and you still want to do it." "I want you to tell him," Ji-hoon said. "Not me, not a lawyer, you." He met her eyes. "Your voice, your number, your terms." She thought about that for a moment. The corridor. Minho's eyes aimed at her collarbone, the smirk he hadn't been able to suppress. "All right," she said. She called him the next afternoon. She didn't text. She called because she wanted him to hear her voice without the buffer of a screen, without the ability to compose himself in the lag between reading and responding. He picked up on the third ring. "Minho," she said. "This is Jane." A pause. "I know who it is." "Good." She sat in her and Ji-hoon's apartment at the kitchen table in the quiet of the afternoon. Her voice was even. $500,000. Damages for the duration of our relationship, paid directly. No negotiation on the figure. You do that, and you make the apology in front of the family, and Ji-hoon considers the matter closed. The silence on the line had a specific texture, not empty, but pressurized. She could hear him breathing. Then he laughed. A short, sharp sound with nothing warm in it. "Never," he said. "You understand me? Not a single cent. Not ever. You want to play this game?" "It's not a game. You come into this family with your history and your—" His voice had gone up, lost its careful register. She listened to it without flinching. "You think a ring makes you untouchable? You think Ji-hoon's money makes you somebody? I don't owe you anything. I will never owe you anything. Tell your husband that." "I'll tell him," she said. "I'm not apologizing. I'm not paying. And you can take that however you want." She let a beat of silence sit on the line, calm and wide. "All right, Minho," she said. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the table and looked out the window at the afternoon, at the city going about its patient, enormous business. She wasn't shaking. She was something else, still and very clear, the way the air is clear after a storm declares itself. She picked the phone back up and typed one message to Ji-hoon. He said never. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, good. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday, printed on cardstock that had once signaled a certain kind of authority and now mostly signaled that Minho still owned a printer. Jane held it for a moment before passing it to Ji-hoon, a family meeting, this Saturday the estate, and watched his face move through nothing in the way it did when he was deciding something. He called it himself, Ji-hoon said. Yes. He set the card down on the counter. Okay, that was all. They drove to the estate on Saturday morning through light autumn traffic, the city easing past the windows in its usual indifferent way. Ji-hoon drove. Jane sat with her hands loose in her lap and watched the streets change from urban density into the quieter, wider roads that led to the family property. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing that needed saying yet. The morning had the quality of a held breath, a moment that understood itself to be a threshold. The grandmother's car was already in the drive. 2 uncles. Sungmin's vehicle parked slightly apart from the others, the way you park when you are ashamed of your association with the occasion. Ji-hoon held the door for Jane. She walked in. She saw him immediately. Minho was seated at the far side of the main room, not standing, not performing any entrance, just sitting in a chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped. He looked up when they came in, and Jane absorbed the change in the single still moment before conversation resumed around her. Dark circles that had not been there a month ago, a quality of thinness to his face, not physical but essential, as if some structural layer had been removed. The suit was the same good cut as always, but worn with a kind of heaviness, a man dressed out of habit, rather than confidence. The shine was gone. That was the only way she could name it, the shine that had always lived in Minho's eyes, the gleam of a person who believes themselves protected from consequence. It was simply gone. She felt, unexpectedly, very little satisfaction. What she felt was closer to something solemn. The uncles settled into chairs. Sungmin stood near the window with his arms crossed, not quite able to look at his son, and not quite able to look away. The grandmother sat in her usual chair at the center of the room, not the head of any particular arrangement, simply the point around which everything else quietly organized itself, as it always had. Minho's father had called it correctly and late. A month ago, the morning after Minho's refusal on the phone, Sung-min had apparently gone home and done the arithmetic. What the continued loss of the companies was costing, what further escalation would cost, what Minho's pride was costing, and what the total came to, and had made a set of decisions with the clean efficiency of a businessman who has finally separated the professional from the personal. The apartment Minho had been occupying returned to the family account. The 2 cars registered in Sung-min's name. Collected. The monthly allowance that Minho had received since turning 20 and had never meaningfully questioned, stopped. No announcement, no confrontation, just the ordinary mechanisms of support switched off. Minho had spent a month finding out what his name was worth when it wasn't backed by anything. The answer, it turned out, was a precise and humbling number. He stood up. The room didn't go theatrical. There was no shifting of chairs, no held breath made audible. It was simply that everyone became very still, the way you become still when you recognize that something real is about to happen and you don't want the weight of your own movement to disturb it. Minho looked at Jane. I asked everyone. Here, he said, and his voice was different, quieter, without the old architecture of ease, because you were right about how it should be done. He paused, swallowed. In front of everyone. He knelt. Not a performance this time. There was no smoothness in it, no managed quality. His knees hit the floor with the gracelessness of a man who isn't practiced in this, who has no muscle memory for it because he has never in his life done it before, and the absence of grace was the most honest thing he had ever offered her. I'm sorry, Minho said, for the relationship, for what I did during it, for what I said after, for the dinner, for the cafe. He looked at the floor briefly and then made himself look up. For all of it. You didn't deserve any of it. The room was very quiet, not the tight pressurized quiet of a month ago, something looser than that, the quiet of a thing finally arriving at its destination. I can't pay $500,000, he said. I know what I said. I know I said never. A muscle moved in his jaw. I was wrong to say it. I was wrong about a lot of things. He looked at her steadily, and there was no smirk, no deflection, nowhere for his eyes to go except her face. I have 100,000. It's most of what I have. I'm asking you to accept it, and I'm asking you to know that I mean the apology. Not because of the companies, not because my father cut me off. He paused. Because you stood in that kitchen and told me who you were, and I chose contempt, and I've had a month to sit with what that says about me. No one spoke. Jane looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough to be thorough, to take the full measure of what was in front of her. She had learned to tell the difference. She had spent 8 months learning to tell the difference, and several years afterward rebuilding the instrument of her own discernment, and it was working now, quietly and carefully, taking a reading. What she found was not a man reformed. Not yet. Possibly not ever completely. But a man cracked open by consequence, genuinely inhabiting the wreckage of his own choices for the first time, without a floor beneath him that someone else had installed. That was enough to work with. It was not her job to determine if it was enough for anything else. I accept the apology, Jane said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. She let the words stand on their own, without softening or qualifying, because they meant what they said. And the 100,000, she said. Yes. Minho's shoulders dropped, not in relief exactly, but in the physical way of a person who has been braced for a long time and has been given permission to stop. He rose from the floor without elegance, and she did not help him. And that was also right. Ji-hoon called his finance director from the hallway, briefly, and the companies began their return before lunch. Seung-min, who had said almost nothing the entire morning, shook Ji-hoon's hand and looked at Jane with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not warm exactly, but direct. Clear. The look of a man finally seeing something that had been in front of him for some time. Thank you, he said to her. It came out simply. She nodded. She let it be enough. The grandmother had ordered food. Of course she had. The family gathered around the long table. The same room, the same arrangement of people who had last sat here in the tight, fractured atmosphere of the first dinner. And it was different now in the way that rooms are different when the thing they have been waiting to resolve has finally resolved. Jane sat beside Ji-hoon. He found her hand under the table after a few minutes, the way he always did when they were in rooms that required performance, a quiet, private anchor. She turned her palm up and held his hand back. Minho sat near the far end, quieter than he had ever been in any room she had shared with. He ate, he answered when spoken to. Once an uncle made a joke that caught him off guard, and he laughed, briefly, startled, like a man who had forgotten he still could. It was warm. It was long overdue. Jane looked around the table, at the grandmother, who was telling an auntie something that was making her cover her mouth with her hand, at the uncles, talking over each other about something entirely unrelated, at Ji-hoon beside her, his thumb moving once gently across her knuckles. She had arrived at this family with a feast and a history, and both had taken their full time to settle. Some lessons cost everything before they stick. Some tables take longer to set than others. She picked up her chopsticks, and she ate.